Good afternoon. My name is Eileen Quigley. I'm the Executive Director of the Clean Energy Transition Institute. I use she, her pronouns. On behalf of CETI's board and staff, I welcome you here this afternoon to join in this very important conversation about the growth of data centers, artificial intelligence, the electricity grid, and the Northwest goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions at the pace and scale that the climate crisis requires. Before we get underway, I want to respectfully acknowledge that the land on which we gather today is the traditional land of the Coast Salish people. I recognize the Squamish, Duwamish, and Stillaquamish tribes, and that they are the original and ongoing stewards of this land. At CETI, we're committed to learning and building meaningful relationships with Indigenous peoples, and we support their priorities and self-determination. As part of today's forum and connected to our rural and tribal community decarbonization program, in addition to the many topics that our panels are going to talk about, we also want to explore the equity trade-offs of increased demand for electricity on the Northwest Indigenous and rural communities where data centers are and could be located. Today we will hear from 6 experts. Right? I think I have a slide. Yes. We will hear from 6 experts in the Northwest clean energy ecosystem, each of whom is playing a key role in decarbonizing our region and has given a lot of thought to the opportunities and challenges that potential data center growth could have on the region's energy systems. A growing reliance on digital technologies, cloud computing, and AI is driving a surge in energy-intensive data centers in the country and here in the Northwest. We are going to explore the forecasts of data center growth and what it could mean to the work that we are trying to do here to decarbonize the grid equitably. Our goal is to have a fruitful discussion that leads to productive outcomes and a call for collaborative innovation, perhaps around first-of-a-kind actions that the Northwest, which is known for its expertise and foresightedness in electricity, could pursue to solve for this new need for load. We hope you will join us for a reception in the lobby after the forum has concluded. I want to thank our host, K&L Gates, for graciously sharing this lovely space with us today. This is the 3rd time that we have held an event here, and every single time it looks like this. It's amazing. I also want to, and they've also provided the technology that's made it possible for us to film this event, and we'll be able to disseminate it widely afterwards since we can only fit 70 or so in here. I also want to thank CETI's Board of Directors. I'd like to ask you to wave or stand. Liz, Thomas, oh, there they all are. They're seated all together. Kathleen Hebert, Sean McGarry, Ross McFarland, where's Rob? And Rob Davis in the back. We have 2 additional board-elect members in the room, or one who isn't here yet, I don't think, but one is definitely here because she's on the panel with us. So Crystal Ball and Mariah Kennedy, who's the Director of Energy Policy at Microsoft, will be joining the board tomorrow when they get elected in at our annual board meeting. We're also fortunate to have many of CETI's donors and funders here today. So the stars that you see on the name tags indicate that you are speaking with a CETI donor. We would not be here if not for their generous support. So I'd like to ask you in joining me in applauding them here now. Finally, I want to acknowledge my fantastic team. So Research Director Stacia Dreyer. Where is Stacia? There, back there. Director of Development and Operations, Gino DeFore. Over there. Communications Manager Jamie Potasek, are you in the room? She's still outside. A Research Analyst Ruby Moore Bloom and Jean Curry. All right, as well as Research Consultant Elizabeth Wilmot in the back. Elizabeth wrote this fabulous document that I hope all of you will take home and read, and is a longtime collaborator of mine, lucky for me, and is consulting on a variety of topics with CETI this year. Okay. For those of you who are not familiar with the Clean Energy Transition Institute, we're an independent, nonpartisan research and analysis nonprofit organization, and our mission is to accelerate an equitable clean energy transition in the Northwest. We provide unbiased research and analytics. We frame, translate, and demystify complex decarbonization solutions, and we convene stakeholders and decision makers to have fact-based conversations about how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the Northwest. The CETI decarbonization forums are exploring clean energy transition challenges to guide decision-making by policymakers and others engaged in the transition from fossil to clean energy. We produce research and analysis summaries like the 101 document that I just held up that Elizabeth was the primary author on, and as backgrounders to unpack the complexities of topics that we are exploring. If you're not already on our newsletter list, please sign up to receive notification about additional forums and other program updates. While recent forecasts have indicated a surge in energy-intensive data centers, as Krista will discuss with us in a minute, there's considerable uncertainty about just how much electricity is needed, as tech companies understandably do not want to share where they want their data centers to be and how much they need. So there's a concern that the demand may not be as high as forecast due to the fact that companies will approach multiple utilities at the same time, potentially leading to double counting. However, we actually want to explore today the fact that we are seeing enormous development, and we'd like to figure out if there's a way for us to develop accurate information about the demand for power so that planners can accurately forecast load. Another factor we want to explore is the fact that many of the companies building the data centers and the artificial intelligence operations have clean energy goals. We see an opportunity that these companies striving for clean, firm power could fund innovation and drive technologies that could help us solve our demand problem. We'd also like to see agencies, advocates, and utilities working with the data center firms to build the clean, firm power that will serve not only the tech community, the tech company demand, but also power for building, industrial, and transportation electrification. Finally, we want to explore how the Northwest might innovate for decarbonization. This is my final slide, and it shows you how data centers in the Northwest compare to the rest of the country. You can see that Virginia, Texas, and California have the largest concentrations in the country, but Oregon ranks 7th and Washington 10th in this particular data set. I've also seen Oregon at times ranked 5th. The Northwest first became a hub for small data centers during the 1990s, due in part to its proximity to emerging tech companies in the Puget Sound and Silicon Valley. There are people in this room that were very involved in that at that time, my colleagues at Real Networks, as well as many other Microsoft people. In the 2010s, access to underwater fiber optic cable, competitive electricity pricing, low carbon hydropower, and economic incentives attracted an increased concentration of hyperscale data centers in the region. A hyperscale data center is a massive data center that's engineered for large-scale workloads. So, enough from me. Let's get to our experts. We're going to start with Brian Janous, who has over 20 years of experience in the electricity and data center industries. He's the co-founder and chief commercial officer at Cloverleaf Infrastructure now. He was vice president of energy at Microsoft, and he oversaw the company's global data center energy footprint. He's going to offer his thoughts on the future of energy infrastructure related to rapid growth of data centers and AI, and help us understand the nature of the challenge of load growth, but also share opportunities for innovation, particularly how AI might be used to improve energy efficiency and to manage the clean energy transition, strategies for integrating renewable energy resources into the grid, and share lessons from around the world. So, turn it over.
Yeah, I'm going to have 15 minutes.
Yeah, I forgot to mention he has 15 minutes.
I'm going to do a small subset of those things in 15 minutes, if any of them. Well, thanks everyone. Really excited to be here. As Eileen said, I've been working in this industry for quite a long time. I've been about 25 years in the power and utilities industry. I started at Microsoft in 2011, thanks to Christian Bellotti, who encouraged me to come over back when it wasn't even clear why a tech company needed an energy person. I remember telling Christian during our interview discussion, as this sounded like a dead-end job, like why would Microsoft ever need someone that understands something about power? And Christian's like, no, I really think there's something to this cloud thing, and I think energy is going to be really important. Of course, at the time, I mean, the data centers we were talking about were quite small. I mean, we were talking about some of those early investments for Microsoft is in Quincy, Washington, and Christian has told the story about how when they built this, I think was it 20 megawatts that you all thought? 13. And they all thought they were going to get fired because they're like, why would you ever need a 13 megawatt data center? Right? Because that just seemed way too big, right? And here's where we are today, right? We're talking about adding 100 gigawatts of data centers into this country by 2030. Some of these campuses are in excess of a gigawatt. I remember, to contrast the conversation about getting fired for building a 13 gigawatt or megawatt data center. When I was still at Microsoft and I left in August of 23, this was the summer before that, I got a call from a utility in Wisconsin, and they had this was the site of the former Foxconn, it was supposed to be a big Foxconn facility, but it only got partially built out. And the utility called and said, hey, I've got this site and it can do more than a gigawatt of power on a single site. And I said, I don't know what in the world I would do with a site that could be more than a gigawatt. That doesn't even make sense. And then 2 weeks later, I was sitting in a meeting. This was about 4 or 5 months before ChatGPT-3 was released. I was sitting in a meeting and we were talking about OpenAI and just AI in general, and that's when the light bulb went off. And I was like, that's what I would do with a gigawatt site. So I called the utility back, said, we definitely want that site. That is now the Microsoft AI campus in Racine. But that was the first time it even occurred to me that these campuses could even possibly be that big. And that's when, and this is before a lot of utilities started restating their load forecasts. That kind of happened later. That was more in the spring to summer of 23. A lot of utilities started waking up going, whoa, we've way under forecast this. Like we didn't really anticipate. And there was a lot of things that followed. I mean, I think the data center industry was certainly, I think, surprised as well. I don't think anyone was really planning for AI in terms of the infrastructure side. So definitely the signals that were coming out of the industry were not as clear as they could have been. But it's put us in this situation now where we have a huge demand for power. Everyone is clamoring to get it as quickly as possible. And it's raising lots of questions of how are we going to meet these needs? They're very important things to think about in terms of just national security interests that we have in this country. Like we want to build the most advanced models in the United States. We do not want those to be built in China. However, we have a lot of constraints on how we're going to do it. China does not have the same constraints that we have in terms of things like grid planning and deciding, well, we're just going to take a bunch of land and make a power plant and run some more transmission lines. Like we do things differently here. So we have to think more creatively about how do we ensure that we can meet the demands of this industry, but do it in a way that still allows us to maintain our commitment to doing it sustainably. And there's a lot of debates going on right now, and I want to share a couple of thoughts as to, one, I think what some of the challenges are, but then two, why there's maybe reason to be optimistic about it. A huge debate that's happening right now that I'm sure you've heard a lot about is around building gas plants. Like how are we going to meet the needs of these super dense baseload resources that need lots of power 24/7? And the answer that people come to very quickly is, well, we just need gas plants, right? We'll do gas plants behind the meter. You're seeing tons of announcements about this. GE, Vernova, Chevron are working on a big program together. There was an announcement a couple of weeks ago about a 4.5 gigawatt campus in Pennsylvania that is all gas powered. And so this is sort of the dominant theme that we're hearing in the industry. And I think that part of the challenge that we're having right now is everyone who is in the data center industry has had to become an energy expert overnight. And everyone who's in the energy industry has had to become a data center expert overnight. Well, it turns out both of those things are really hard. And if you haven't done either of those things a long time, you come up with some pretty simplistic solutions to this problem. And the simplistic solution that is being proposed is, well, I've got this baseload resource that's 24/7, so I have to match it with another baseload resource that's 24/7 that produces power. The problem is we've been planning the grid for 125 years, and we haven't done it that way. A utility doesn't go, oh, I've got an amusement park showing up into town, so now I've got to go find a power source that produces power in the shape of an amusement park. That's not how the grid's planned, right? We've been doing this a long time. Like, the actual solution is the grid, right? I mean, 125 years ago, Sam Enzel came around and looked around a very balkanized energy system. This is in Chicago at the time. And he saw that, wow, there's all these mini grids all over the place. Every neighborhood had their own power plant to provide lighting, mostly to wealthy homeowners. And then every factory had their own power plant, right? And so we had this complete distributed balkanized system. And he came along and said, hey, it'd be a lot more efficient if we actually stitched these things together. Like, what if we started connecting these things, and I could start building much larger power plants that would be more efficient, and I could connect more people at a lower cost, and that's exactly what happened. So we figured this out 125 years ago, that the answer to this problem we're talking about is the grid. It is not that every data center has its own power plant. That was what's happening. That's like 1900 thinking, is like every factory should have their own power plant. And actually the factories and the manufacturing facilities were the slowest adopters of the grid, because they were like, oh no, grid, that's for homeowners, and that's not for serious work like factories. And eventually, the cost and the efficiency became so much better at the grid level that they had to give in and go, oh, this is actually much better to be connected to the grid. So this is sort of where we are right now. We're sort of reliving what happened 125 years ago. But the right answer has always been and will always be the grid. And so this is where we have to think about what are the opportunities where we can actually take advantage of this moment, of this increased demand, and actually do it in a way that meets the needs of the industry, that is sustainable, but also meets the speed and scale demands that these industries have. And it's not rocket science. It's just complicated. I mean, it's the stuff that all of you are involved in one way or another. And this is what we do at Cloverleaf, where we find locations that are optimized for connecting these very large, multi-hundred megawatt, if not gigawatt loads. But that's just step one, because we also have to work with utilities and regulators to understand how do we make sure that there's rates that are designed that allow us to make the sort of investments we need to make, that you need to make, and that also insulate some of these investments from other ratepayers, because we're talking about massive, billions and billions of dollars being invested on behalf of single customers. So protecting other ratepayers and ring fencing these costs is super important. We have to think about what are the technologies that we have at the grid level that we can utilize to achieve this speed, scale, sustainability goal. And then what are the resources we also have behind our meter? Because data centers actually are great grid resources. And this is something that Christian and I worked on a ton when we were at Microsoft, which is data centers have a power plant, they have an energy storage plant, and they just also happen to have this really big load sitting next to it. So there's a whole bunch of optimization that you can do with those energy assets that oftentimes is underutilized by data center operators and by the grid. So there's a lot of opportunity for coordination between data centers and utilities, especially if we're talking about city-sized facilities. I mean, there's almost no other way to do it than find ways to coordinate. So here's where I'm optimistic. There's two things that I think about that give me a sense of optimism. First of all, the main driver behind all this investment are a handful of extraordinarily wealthy companies. And those companies want to go very, very fast. Now, you might take that and say, actually, those are two bad things, because you have the richest companies in the world are going to do whatever they want, and they're going to do it and say, well, climate be damned, I don't care, I can do whatever I want. That's a way to look at this. There's another way to look at this, though. If you think about the economic motivation that they have, there is probably no greater business in the world right now than turning electrons into data. Like the profit margin in that energy conversion is enormous. It's what I call the watt-bit spread. It's the spread between the cost of a watt and the value of the bit that you can create with that watt. It's huge. And so that in and of itself creates an opportunity to tap into that demand to spur significant investment in grid infrastructure. And I'll take the example of transmission. Like transmission is one of the hardest things to build. And it's hard because, yeah, you've got to site it and you've got to get, easements and you got to do that. But that's not actually the hardest part. The hardest part is the cost sharing and recovery of that asset. It's a very difficult asset to figure out, well, who's benefiting from that transmission line, right? But when you have a single anchor tenant at the end of that line that says, hey, I'm willing to fund the investment in that line years ahead of when it would otherwise be built, it creates massive opportunity for investment. We're dealing with this right now in a project inside of MISO where we're pulling in a project that MISO had planned years in the future, and we're doing it on the back of a single data center investment to say, no, we want that to happen like years sooner. And we will fund that capital to ensure that happens years sooner. So we have a huge opportunity to tap into the willingness to pay that exists with some of these customers. We're working on a project actually in Oregon right now that's doing the same thing with a multi-day storage asset, where we were talking with this company and they had this battery and they've been talking with the utility a long time, and the utility wanted to do it, but kind of came back to this sort of cost recovery issue, is like, can we really justify the investment? Well, it just so happened that the location where this battery is was right next door to a huge cluster of data centers that were screaming for more power. And we're like, guys, this is obvious. We just got to connect the dots between these two things. So you have this customer that has a very high willingness to pay that wants to go very quickly. And so this is, the quickly part is also really interesting and I think advantageous for us who are trying to find a way to do this sustainably. Because the one thing that's faster than building a natural gas plant is not building a natural gas plant, right? If you can find ways to better leverage the existing grid, because the fastest thing is always going to be efficiency, right? How do we get more out of virtual power plants? How do we get more out of grid enhancing technologies? How do we get more out of storage as transmission? All these things that we can actually do much quicker than building new power plants or even building new transmission corridors, right? And so there's a huge opportunity to tap into the existing grid, which the vast majority of the time is severely underutilized, right? And so if we start bringing in more baseload resources, baseload loads into a system, better utilizing that system, manage the peaks more effectively. And a lot of you probably saw the Duke report that came out a month or two ago that was talking about with just 2% flexibility in the current system, you could add something like 125 gigawatts of capacity in the United States. Well, going back to my previous slide, how much do we need for data centers? Oh, it's just about 125 gigawatts, right? And so that's without adding any new baseload resources. And so there's so much untapped potential and efficiency. It's just the challenge we have is it is complicated, right? I mean, deploying solutions like that involves dealing with all of these different stakeholders and understanding, how to work with grid operators, how to work with regulators, how to understand the cost causation principle. So it's not easy, but it's not impossible. And at the end of the day, it actually helps solve the needs of the industry faster and more sustainably. And so this is where I get optimistic when and most of the stories that you read right now about data center load growth are negative. Most of them are, this is bad, this is going to cause coal plants to stay online longer, this is going to cause more gas plants to be built. And that is a possible future. Like I'm not so Pollyannish about this that I don't see the risks of this industry running too fast and breaking things. However, I do think we can chart an alternative path, and I do think there are examples out there of projects and companies that are working to do that. My company is one of them, but there are certainly a lot of others who are working towards that end as well. It just requires a partnership because it's a lot more complicated than building one data center with one power plant, right? This is at the grid level, it's at the region level. It's really tapping into the diversity of resources that exists out there to ensure that we can meet the needs of this industry, which is critically important for our country, but also do it in a way that helps us maintain a commitment and fidelity to the climate goals that I know that we are all in this room committed to. So with that, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Brian. We're going to move now to Crystal. And Crystal Ball is the Executive Director of the Pacific Northwest Utilities Conference Committee, known as PNUCC. And Crystal's going to talk about PNUCC's annual load forecast, how it's compiled, how the data center load growth was impacted in the 2024 PNUCC forecast, and perhaps give us a sneak peek at this year's forecast, which is coming out very soon.
Thanks, Eileen. There we go. Wow. I really love Brian's optimism. I feel like I'm a little Samuel Insull with my presentation after that. Because as Eileen said, I manage a trade association for electric utilities in the 4 Northwest states. And I have been doing that for 3 years now. And I joke that Crystal Ball finally found a job in forecasting. So I have to get past that, right? I really appreciate the opportunity to share the PNUCC product with all of you. I'm going to start just with a brief explanation of what PNUCC is. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we put that product together, and then I'll show you some pictures from that product. So I really am invited here to provide a regional utility perspective. And what PNUCC is, what you need to remember is it is the place in our region in the 4 Northwest states where the investor-owned utilities and public power and industry partners come together. Many people don't think that happens, but it happens at PNUCC, and it has been happening for a long time. This region is very collaborative, and one of the ways where we collaborate is at PNUCC. So that's one of the most important things that I think you should remember about the organization that I manage. It is the place where public power, like Seattle City Light, comes together with Puget Sound Energy and other industry partners. And what we have been doing for decades is getting information from the utilities and putting together this regional utility perspective. And we do this every year, and it's called the Northwest Regional Forecast. What it is a sum of utilities, load forecast, and resources. So what they're planning to serve that load with over 10 years. And each year, PNUCC staff very consistently collects information, and we aggregate this information, and that is provided directly by the utilities. It's provided by utilities, individual utilities, but also PNGC Power, which is an entity that represents 25 public power utilities now, and the Bonneville Power Administration. So really what I'm trying to say is we get the information from the many, many utilities in this region, and that's very valuable. And again, it was over this, what we call the Northwest Power Act footprint. And so it's the states of Idaho, Washington, Oregon, and Montana. And really it has been a longstanding resource that collects information in a consistent way. And we share this information to build understanding about the evolving power system in our region. What it is not is a resource adequacy assessment. Others in our region, like the Western Power Pool through the Western Resource Adequacy Program and the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, put together a resource adequacy assessment. WEC, Western Electricity Coordinating Council, does that too for the West. So really the PNUCC is just, product is a snapshot of what the region might look like in 10 years. And it is based on information that we collect directly from utilities. We don't do any modeling. We don't get very fancy. Really, utilities just respond to a questionnaire, and then we put together a regional picture. So I'm going to show you that regional picture now with that setup. 3 main takeaways that I want to share with you today are the load growth projection continues to surge. That's consistent with last year's outlook. Resource additions are at risk of not being deployed to meet this projected surge in demand, and regional collaboration is essential for serving the needs of Northwest customers. this is our big load reveal. And as Eileen said, we do this every year. Next week, we are likely to publish the 2025 information. So I'm going to share with you the pictures from last year. But I can tell you, different from previous years, what we're seeing on the load projection for 2025 is about the same thing. So as Brian said, 2023, people started to really wake up to this. But what we saw in our forecast, there was a step up between 2022 and 2023. We reported on that. We didn't get a whole lot of attention. But 2023 to 2024, when we projected a possible 30% increase in electricity demand in this region over the next 10 years, wow, people really started to pay attention to our product. And we have used this product to build understanding. Again, this is the Samuel Insull way of utility planning. Forecast a need, then think about what resources might meet that demand. And this is how we put this forecast together. And this projected surge in demand is pretty extraordinary. 30% increase over 10 years. It's over 7,000 megawatts. We are here in the city of Seattle, and that equates to about serving 7 cities the size of Seattle. So it's really, for our region, an extraordinary amount of projected load growth. This picture shows on the green the annual average energy. It also shows peak hour for winter and summer. That peak is growing extraordinarily fast too. And that's something that Brian brought up, is these peaks, because we have all these resources, we use them at the times when we need them most. You have to have those available reliably, and if you don't, you might suffer some energy supply shortages. And so utilities don't like to do that. Consumers don't like to experience. And what we know about data centers is they need reliable power supply. So we have to plan for those peaks. And we are seeing in this region that the summer peak is actually accelerating faster than the winter peak. And that's because it's getting hotter. And people really rely more on electricity for staying cool. So I've been asked many times, what's driving this demand? And I say, we get information from utilities, we aggregate that information, and we show a regional picture. Quantitatively, we can ask some of our utilities that report this information, what's driving the demand, but we don't break it up. So I can't tell you what percentage of this projected increase in demand is from data centers. I can't tell you how much is from utilities planning for the electrification of transportation, buildings, all of that. I can just tell you that when we add it all up, it's an extraordinary increase in demand. And we do know that companies developing data centers are driving increase in demand, but we also have policies in this region to electrify these sectors. And that is driving an increase in demand too. So I know we're here to talk about data centers, but really we just need to accept that electricity demand is growing across this region and we need to plan for it. I am not watching the time, but if I go too far, will you bring me back? I'm going to move from the projected increase in demand. Again, this is what could happen. This is not what will happen, but based on utility information, we are seeing a projected increase in demand of 30%, an extraordinary number. I do want to say, I have my notes here, I do want to say that, again, on the electrification and on relying on more digital technologies, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, an economy built on an economy that is more dependent on electricity will be much different than the past, and it will require significant investment in generation, transmission, and distribution. We just can't get away with it. Yes, there's so many other things that'll help us, but we really have to be committed to that infrastructure development because this is significant increase in demand. Okay, here's the other picture that I want you to see. This is what we call needed future resources. Again, utilities forecast what their demand might be, and then they think, okay, how will I meet that demand? And what you can see here is that when we add it all up, in 2024, we saw over 10 years, cumulative 29,000 megawatts of future resources that may be needed. This year, we see about the same thing, and it's about 30,000. 2023 to 2024, again, a significant jump. We went from 17,000 megawatts of needed future resources to this 29,000 megawatts, and this year we're seeing about 30,000 megawatts. Utility plans primarily are relying on wind and solar and storage. So when we think about those resources and having to build more of those resources than traditional baseload, we see, a pretty significant number of future resources needed. The challenge in building these power plants is growing, and these challenges include delays in getting permits, local opposition, transmission constraints, shifting federal energy policies, and more. And it is alarming that some of these resources may not be deployed. And I mentioned resource adequacy assessments. Those resource adequacy assessments are based on these future needed resources. And so these resource adequacy assessments are relying on resources that may not be deployed because of all of the challenges. And that makes us in the utility industry very concerned about meeting these peaks. And we may have energy supply shortages, so we really all need to think about what this means in our region as we plan for these this future demand, and really, again, that commitment to the investment in the resources. Lots of things that we can do in the meantime, but that requires a lot of coordination and regional collaboration. So again, just showing that there's an extraordinary number of planned future resources that utilities may need, and because of all the challenges, these resources may not get deployed. That creates concern among the utility community. All right, just to benchmark, what we have here is our existing Northwest utility generating resources. Again, about 30,000 megawatts of future needed resources over the next 10 years, comparing that to what we have now. And we have about 56,000 megawatts of utility-owned generating resources that we have built over a very long period of time. So you can imagine building 30,000 megawatts of future resources in a short period of time. That's another reason why these resources are at risk of not getting deployed. I'm probably short on time. Just looking here at my notes. I think what I want to leave this audience with is that the Northwest Utilities alone cannot expand the region's energy infrastructure. I hope I have made a case for why we need to expand the energy infrastructure and do a whole lot of other cool things like virtual power plants and grid enhancing technologies. This projected increase in demand comes from many things. Again, that digital economy, relying on cloud computing, and now artificial intelligence, but also our commitments to electrification of some pretty big industries. So I really want to stress that the region's utilities can't do this on their own, that we all need to work together. We all need to be aware of the challenges. And it's really why I think that I have found a really great fit at PNUCC, because I'm passionate about bringing people together. I really appreciate the opportunity to share this information with you all here. And I'm optimistic too. There's some really big challenges. This load, projected load is extraordinary. In order to keep up with it, we're going to have to develop a lot of resources, and the region's going to have to work together to get it done. So thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. Okay, now we're going to shift to the state's perspective. And we're going to start with Edith Baer. And Edith is the policy team lead at the Oregon Department of Energy, and she's overseeing the development of the Oregon Energy Strategy, which is a project that CETI and Evolved Energy Research has been working with ODO for over a year, providing technical and economic analysis for the strategy. So Edith, my question from you is, from your perspective, what particular issues or questions arise in Oregon with respect to data center growth, and how is this growth impacting the state's carbon emission reduction targets?
Thanks, Eileen. Eileen has introduced me, so I'll skip over that and just start by saying that, repeating that we're in the process of developing a state energy strategy. The idea of the energy strategy is to help us identify pathways to meeting our energy policy objectives, which include pretty ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals for across the economy, so not just for the power sector. But I really, it's not just about that. Really, when we're looking at our energy policy objectives, it boils down to, I would say, 4 things: reliability, resilience, affordability, and transitioning to clean energy. And a lot of our focus, the focus of our work has been on this last piece, because the clean energy piece is so critical and requires us to think differently and do things differently than we have been doing them. From a power systems perspective, you know, what needs to be different? There's growing intersectionality between sectors with things like transportation, electrification, and on the generation side, we need to build out clean generation and transmission. So I'm just echoing really what Crystal was just saying. But these other areas also are increasingly under pressure. So reliability is under pressure. We just heard about that. Resilience is an increasing issue. We have extreme weathers, we have weather and wildfires, and affordability is also a growing concern. So we have consumers who are increasingly squeezed, and then we hear concerns over who pays when we get into the data center space, and that's a lot of when we see those critical articles. That's often one of the big topics that comes up. So I'm gonna start by talking briefly about the insights that we're getting from the energy strategy process. We undertook a modeling exercise to understand where we are today and sort of what things might look like out to 2050 and different pathways to meeting our energy policy objectives. And one of the things that we included, of course, was what load growth might look like. So I'm not gonna focus on that 2050 timeframe. I'll focus on the nearer term, kind of looking out 5 years where we see a lot of things happening at once. So over the next 5 years, our modeling found, pretty consistent with PNUCC, a 27% increase in electricity demand. And about 40% of that increase was coming from tech loads. About a quarter of the increase was coming from the residential sector, and the rest is kind of divided up between the other sectors: industry, agriculture, other commercial sectors. So there's load growth happening, and it is a diverse, these are diverse loads that are coming onto the system. It's not just one thing. So there is this near-term pressure. And I just want to add too that from a system-wide perspective, it differs on where you are. It's not electrification that's driving that near-term pressure. Over time, yes, but over the next 5 years, it's not the immediate thing. There are a lot of other drivers out there. And this pressure is ramping up, is coinciding with the ramp up of compliance with Oregon's House Bill 2021, which is our clean electricity standard. It applies to Portland General Electric and Pacificor, our 2 biggest utilities, and calls for an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in terms of electricity sales, 80% reduction by 2030, 90% by 2035, and 100% by 2040. So those are pretty ambitious goals, and we're in the thick of it now, I could say. But another observation, and something that we've been working through, is that a lot of the new loads are expected to come in utility service territories that fall outside of HB 2021. And so when we look at consumer-owned utilities in Oregon, they benefit from a relatively clean, low-carbon electricity generation profile to begin with, as preference customers to BPA's clean hydropower resource. When we talk about these big loads, they can't be served in the same way because of the new single large load policy. And so they're reaching out to the market to get the electrons that they need in the near term. And so I'll just give one example of what we observed. So in Umatilla Electric Co-op territory, we've seen that with the arrival of the tech of an Amazon data center, emissions rose, and this comes from our Department of Environmental Quality's tracking of greenhouse gas emissions. We saw emissions go up really quickly and really significantly because of what they call unspecified market purchases. So when you're buying electrons from the market, DEQ has a kind of emissions profile that's assigned to that because you can't say where it came from, and it's sort of an average profile of the greenhouse gas emissions on the system. And that reflected a really steep increase in greenhouse gas emissions around 2018. But then in 2023, we saw a drop in those emissions that reflected kind of a cleaner resource mix coming in and some more specific resources, some extra hydro coming in, replacing those unspecified purchases. And so there's a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of shifting around that we see, and uncertainty makes us nervous. So we look at that and we say, okay, well, we're uncertain over how many of these tech loads will come onto the system. We're uncertain about, particularly when we talk about COU territories, over what the emissions profile will be of these resources. And so, now I'm going to talk about the solution spaces that we're thinking about. And this is really teeing it up because we don't have solutions, and we're really interested in having this conversation and in being here today. So, I mean, one thing that's really clear, and this is a big conclusion from our energy strategy process, whichever way you go about decarbonizing, we need to build more. We need to build more utility scale resources, and that's transmission and that's generation. And those timelines are not aligned with the timelines on which tech sector loads come onto the system. It's just, they're different timelines. And I think, I was going to start with this, but I forgot. I think that if I were to give a title, I was trying to think of like the title of the thing. I think the title of this could be breaking down the silos, because I do think that the energy transition requires us to break down silos between sectors and to think differently and do things differently. It's not a comfortable space. We can't just do things the way we've been doing them. And I think that you can say the same thing about these conversations between large loads coming on the system and how we accommodate them and how we work together. So that also leads to, like, what are the quick things that we can do? What can we do more quickly to help free up electrons on the system? And I was really happy to hear that some of my themes were Brian was mentioning as well. So one is generating energy savings on site. So there's a report, a recent report by the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission and Confederated Tribes of Umatilla that explores opportunities for energy efficiency and load flexibility in data centers. It looks at the non-server loads. So the server loads are just, I mean, they don't change, right? They're running at pretty much full capacity. That's really valuable. It needs to run. But there's still those non-server loads, and that's an area of pretty significant interest for us. The key findings in that report, looking at, I believe, a mid-high forecast for data center loads in Oregon and Washington, that report looked at Oregon and Washington, was that you could save the equivalent to nearly half the wind power generated in Oregon in 2021 by undertaking those kinds of measures. So it was between 2 and 4 terawatt hours. That's not insignificant. That's helpful. Another is there's a lot of on-site generation, and Brian, you spoke to this a bit too, and I'd be interested to hear more because there's a lot of backup capacity. And there's a lot of, I think, opportunity there to talk about how that can not just sit there in case the power goes out so that those servers can continue operating, but can we talk about how that can be clean and how that can provide a flexibility resource to the system? We can talk about traditional demand response, but then there's also kind of less traditional demand response that's specific to data center profiles. And I've read some articles about kind of shifting non-urgent compute tasks at peak times and things like that. So that's pretty interesting too. And finally, I think that there are always conversations when a new load comes in to a community about how to work in partnership with that community. And I think that that's also a place for exploration. I mean, it could be everything from investing in energy efficiency, end-use energy efficiency in those communities, which also frees up electrons, to, I'll mention, there's a recent report by the International Energy Agency that looks at data center growth around the world. And they talk about both the load growth, but then they talk about the efficiencies that we get across the economy when we use that computing power. And so I think that it would be really interesting to talk about how we can apply that computing power both to modernize our power system, which, if you look at the Western grid, it's one big machine, but that is not how we run it. We split it up and we run it in pieces, and it kind of piece by piece. And so how can we better optimize what we have? And then, more broadly, how can we modernize our broader economy with the capabilities that data centers are coming in? And coming from an agency that really loves data, we would love more data on kind of where we can get our bang for our buck and how we can move forward on these kinds of things. And I think that really the dialogue is really key. And also, to the extent we can, more transparency on what's coming so that we can plan for it and we can have those conversations. So. Thanks, Eileen, for the question. That was a very long answer, but that's my answer to your question.
Well, Kate is going to get a very similar question, so we'll see. But Kate Brouns is Washington Governor Bob Ferguson's climate and energy policy advisor. And so I have a somewhat similar question, which is, I'm interested in the issues and questions that are arising in Washington with regard to data center growth and energy use. And I think also you might be able to tell us a bit about the governor's recently announced task force on this topic.
Absolutely. Thanks, Eileen. Hi, everyone. First, happy Earth Day. I mean, look outside. That is crazy. I wore my green for the occasion. So Washington is obviously seeing a continued massive interest in data centers, as we've talked about today. That's partially because of Washington's really generous data center sales and use tax exemption, which has been expanded in the last decade. It's also because of our reliable clean hydro that comes in abundance, that is increasingly coming in less abundance as we build data centers. Important asterisk to put there. A tidbit I do want to share, we looked at that map of data centers earlier on where they're being built, but central Washington specifically, right in Grant County, is actually, if you measure in terms of leasing activity, it's currently the 6th highest leasing activity zone for data centers in the entire country. And that number is increasing each year. Of course, that has led to a public discourse in Grant County, specifically from their Public Utility Commission, saying that they are concerned that they will start seeing unintended outages due to how hard-pressed their county is to both serve data centers and meet the state's clean energy targets. And so when I think about the outlook for Washington and the concerns that come up for me, all of the technical concerns that we've talked about today are 100% true. But kind of from where I sit and how I'm looking at it, I think we have a narrative here that is setting the clean energy transition and data centers against each other that is pretty concerning from a policy perspective. And now I'm doing the thing where I wrote out my notes frantically in the middle of this presentation. I'm going rogue, so bear with me. I think it's really important that we bring the public along with all of these conversations. So we in this room might have a vision for clean energy growth and data center growth writ large in the Pacific Northwest, but that doesn't mean that the public agrees with that vision and might feel uncomfortable with that vision. And so we've spoken also today about the immense potential for data center investment and capital to kind of be driving this transition, and that is incredible, but we also need to have the trust to go along with that. Something I have seen in the last few months from the public and from interested progressive stakeholders that I'm working with is kind of not speaking for anyone in particular, but it feels like this rising sense of distrust in artificial intelligence and the data center industry because of the massive energy needs and because of some other things happening in the federal discourse that I won't really get into. But that distrust then bleeds into legislative discourse about transmission infrastructure and clean energy infrastructure. So just to give like a quick example here, Washington worked on a major transmission bill. It was a governor priority all of legislative session. And I heard multiple times during those conversations from progressive lobbyists, don't we just need this transmission to serve a bunch of data centers? And that's not true, right? That's partially true, but we also need to build all of this clean energy, and we're also electrifying our homes and our vehicles. But when we have that lack of trust, everyone gets harmed in the process. So it's a bit woo-woo, I guess. You know, we're speaking high level here, but I think this is where government can come in and help coalesce around a shared vision for growth that really brings all of those groups together. And our new album breaks down silos, obviously, the Edith version. So as Eileen touched on, one of the governor's first actions during his administration was to sign an executive order establishing a data center work group. So that project is being spearheaded by myself, by Bo Perschbacher, the governor's economic development and general government policy advisor, and by Washington's Department of Revenue. We've put together an amazing selection of folks for that task force. There's 30 people serving on it right now, and our kickoff meeting is in about 2 weeks. So this group's going to include bipartisan legislators who represent economic and tax interests, who represent environmental interests, who represent Central Washington and Grant County specifically. It will include investor and consumer-owned utilities, tribes, environmental nonprofits, environmental justice nonprofits, the industry, obviously, for tech and for data centers, labor unions, higher education, and local government. And so this work group will also have 2 subcommittees, one of them focused on tax revenue and economic development, and the other one focused on energy, natural resource impacts, and cultural resource impacts. We've seen an immense amount of interest in this work group so far, which makes me a little bit nervous. With no marketing and this just being like a blurb on the Department of Revenue's website, we had 222 people sign up for the newsletter within 5 days without, publicizing it at all. So I think this is obviously a conversation that the public knows a lot about and cares a lot about. Policy and regulatory recommendations are going to be due to the governor by December 1st. And those goals, as stated in the executive order, are to balance growing the industry with revenue that the state needs, with our energy constraints, and with protecting our state's irreplaceable environmental and cultural resources, and meeting the state's clean energy targets at the same time, obviously. I really think, though, that the other goal coming out of this is to have the government kind of build trust and a shared vision for how we can grow data centers in Washington. And right now, I think that vision is being driven partially by local governments, but also partially by industry because they have the capital to make it happen. And so how can we do that in more of a shared way that builds that necessary trust? And then the last thing I'll say here is that, there are mutually desirable objectives here, and they are entirely possible, and we've talked about them today. I recently looked at the Data Center Coalition's policy recommendations to the federal government, and they mirrored goals that we should all be working on together. And they also mirrored all legislative ideas that we have worked on progressively in Washington the last several years. So these recommendations include developing new generation technologies like geothermal or like nuclear, optimizing the grid with grid enhancing technologies and capacity upgrades, proactive long-term transmission planning, especially across multiple states, and permitting reform, so quicker resolution of administrative and judicial reviews. So like I said, all legislation that we have worked on in Washington in the past, and I think it would be even more effective if we work on that in collaboration with data centers and with the tech industry moving forward. Thanks, Eileen.
Great. Thank you very much. The last 2 people we're going to hear from are representatives of the advocacy organizations, and we're going to start with Diane Brandt. Diane is the Policy and Legislative Affairs Director at Renewable Northwest. So Diane, how has the recently forecasted data center load growth shifted the way Renewable Northwest is working with its members to promote responsible development of renewable energy resources in the Pacific Northwest?
Thanks, Eileen. That's a great question. I think I'll start quickly by, some of you might be familiar with Renewable Northwest, others might not, because I think that's kind of at the heart of this question. We're a nonprofit 501c3 working on decarbonization in the BPA footprint that Crystal mentioned earlier, but we're also a membership organization. We receive funds from our dues-paying members, which are usually our nonprofit or our for-profit. Get those mixed up in my brain sometimes. And then we also have nonprofit members. So the profile of our for-profit members, renewable energy industry, renewable energy businesses, law firms, permitting, all of the supports, has definitely changed in the last couple of years. Among those members, we now have large energy buyers. So Google, Meta, AWS, and we work, if they're not members right now, we work with them very closely. I think, I remember 2 years ago, right after the 2023 session ended in Oregon and Washington, and it was the session where we talked a lot about the CHIPS Act, at least in Oregon. And almost immediately we saw load forecast increases coming out from our utilities. And we thought, oh, interesting. And then it only continued what Crystal showed us from 2024. And so we've known and been watching for a couple years about how this is changing the way that we do business, adding urgency to some of the solutions that we're trying to push forward. And also realizing, because of the speed of this, also acknowledging a bit of the chaos that we're dealing with right now and the uncertainty that is hitting us from all different angles, we really need to focus. Where are our windows of opportunity? And so, and as our internal discussions have evolved, we go back to basic economics, if economics can be basic, I guess. Supply and demand. So supply and demand, not in the power sense, but yes, also. The basic laws that it typically follows, we're in a classic case of where demand is outpacing our supply. And what's the result of that? We're seeing it in terms of costs, and the rates are going up. And we are forced with a lot of hard conversations about how are we going to alleviate this pressure that we're seeing in this imbalance. So on the supply side, it's generation. Crystal has shown us what we're facing in terms of the generation supply that is needed, that's coming from that demand. But equally important, if not more so, is the transmission piece of that supply. We are equally constrained there, and it feels like a different set of calculus a lot of times, partly because of the dynamic that we're facing in the region of the balkanized way that we manage the system. I love that Brian started out with the answer is the grid, because that is absolutely what we're feeling right now. And how do we have more of the collaboration between the public power and the IOU sectors, both on planning on the generation side, but how does transmission get rolled into that? As a region, we haven't had to do such a large planning effort and such a massive load growth on the transmission side since the 70s or 80s. And at that time, it was a very different proposition. And that is kind of where we are focusing at the moment, is how can we make inroads and gains in the transmission side when 75 to 80% is this federal agency that we all rely on, even if they are not our power providers. And then the other transmission providers in the region as well. How do we get them to talk and to coordinate? So some of the things that we have invested in and are working on include efforts like West Tech, trying to set the table to bring all of the different groups together to talk technically about what does the planning look like, where are we headed. At the state level, trying to find these windows of opportunities, also leveraging our data center partners in this. So Kate mentioned a transmission bill in Washington. We had a similar one in Oregon as well. We coordinated behind the scenes on trying to establish state level transmission authorities. with the lack of the regional organization in the Northwest, what can we do on more micro levels, state levels, in order to replicate what we could gain from an RTO or a broader organizing entity. So thinking about the 3 Ps, the planning, the paying, the permitting, but especially the planning. So I think that we are seeing, we're on the same page of what we're hearing from our partners in this, from the states and from PNUCC. Brian definitely laid out what we're thinking. In terms of solutions, I mentioned a couple bills that we worked on, the Transmission Authority. We very much are worried about the conversations on permitting and siting. We've been working in this space for years, but we are seeing it in real time right now on transmission, not just Boardman to Hemingway, but now the Harborton Reliability Project in Portland that is expanding on existing right-of-ways, which is what we've always said we should focus on, using what we already have versus greenfield. And it is facing some very big difficulties and challenges from public opposition. So to Kate's point of bringing the public along as well, is in addition to the planning and the actually figuring out what are the lines that we need to build and agreeing on that and solving that cost allocation piece, that nut that we're trying to crack, it's also recognizing that the way that we do business or the way we build projects here really involves communities, and we need to do more work on that side of making sure that the public opposition is not something we're running into with every project. Otherwise, it's going to, well, I don't know if I think we all understand the end of that sentence because we're seeing it with B2H and now with the Harborton project. So it's a bit of an all of the above approach, but really seeing the crux of where we can leverage data centers and partner here is how can we use that for the better and moving forward on transmission, in the transmission side of things.
Great. Thank you. So Joshua Basofin is the Oregon Clean Energy Program Director at Climate Solutions. We were talking earlier about what great representation we have from Oregon today. Not often the case in Washington events. Joshua, advocates have been running legislation related to data centers during the current session in Oregon. What are the concerns and questions and issues regarding data centers from your perspective? And what are some of the tools and solutions we need to address them?
Thanks, Eileen. I was once at a climate summit where Al Gore spoke last, and he made the joke, everything's been said, but not everyone's had a chance to say it. And I feel a little bit like that right now. Some of this is going to sound familiar, but I'm going to talk about it from my organization's particular perspective. So a couple of years ago, when Climate Solutions started learning about the major load growth that's projected for data centers and the implications of that, for the transmission system, for our clean energy future, we thought, well, we want data centers to use clean energy, and we thought that was pretty simple. And we quickly learned that it's a lot more complicated than that. So what we understood is that there's an enabling ecosystem that will accommodate data center load growth in Oregon sustainably and actually help with our clean energy transition. So I'm going to talk about a few elements of that. And then I'm going to mention 3 bills that are currently pending in the Oregon legislative session. So what are the 4 major factors I think are important for this enabling ecosystem for data centers? I think grid modernization is really important. We have a really old grid. You heard a lot about that today. It needs a lot of updating and modernizing. Transmission cost allocation. Data centers use significant transmission and infrastructure on the system, and we really need to figure out a way to carve out the costs of that and properly allocate it to those entities. Regional markets, we've been having a lot of discussions about day-ahead markets. Those will likely set precedents for how we organize markets into the future, including a full regional transmission organization. And finally, access to clean energy. How are we going to actually get the underlying resources for data centers to run on clean energy? So I'll go through these pretty quickly and then get to the bills. So Oregon's grid hasn't been updated since the 1970s, not extensively at least. And data center load growth is going to strain the grid. As others have alluded to, there's major permitting delays and land use restrictions that limit new line builds. Boardman to Hemingway line took about 20 years just to permit, as an example, and that is just far too long. We can't wait that long for new transmission lines. And then we have this enormous queue on BPA's system with generation resources waiting to get in, over 180 gigawatts, according to a recent interview with John Hairston, the BPA administrator. So a couple of solutions here. We really need to deploy grid enhancing technologies at scale. These are hardware and software solutions that expand the capacity and efficiency of the grid. This picture is of a dynamic line rating, which is a device that you can put on a line that monitors ambient conditions and helps operators to adjust the capacity of that line in real time. Also helps you understand where the line is brushing against vegetation, and has some major wildfire mitigation benefits as well. So they're small, but they have a lot of impact and a lot of benefit, and they also don't cost very much. Advanced conductors is another type of grid enhancing technology that we really need. They can increase the capacity on lines upwards of 40-50%, according to some studies I've seen. And then there's some technologies that can route power around the grid more efficiently. So those are really important. We also need to reform the permitting process for new lines. I'm going to talk about a bill in the Oregon legislature that would do that as well. Again, we need to figure out how to better understand what the costs and infrastructure are for data centers and properly allocate those. That's really important, both in terms of reliability, because we need data center operators to pay for those, so that the grid can operate in an efficient and reliable way, and also so that those costs don't fall on the backs of other ratepayers, particularly residential ratepayers. Right now, they're kind of getting spread across rate classes, and we can really do a better job of more accurately allocating those costs. So creating a separate rate class for data centers is really important, as well as a minimum take percentage. We've seen this in a lot of different states and jurisdictions where we say, hey, data centers, you're forecasting the amount of energy you think you need. We're going to put you on the line for a certain percentage of that. Maybe it's 80%, maybe it's 90%, maybe it's 70%, but some percentage of that, there needs to be a commitment from the data center operator that they're going to take that amount of energy. Otherwise, if the data center winds down its operations or leaves the state, other ratepayers are on the hook for that. Single markets are much more efficient than split markets. That's just I think that's just a truism in terms of looking at regional markets. Right now, BPA is very inclined to join SPP Markets Plus as a day-ahead market. There's another day-ahead market that's spinning off of the California Independent System Operator. And if other utilities go with the CAISO spinoff, then we'll have a split market. That could create a situation where, as we move into more extensive markets like RTOs, we continue to have that split market structure, and that is just going to significantly reduce the efficiency gains and the cost gains that we would have for procuring clean energy resources on a regional footprint. So we really need BPA to be considering all of the market options and to be thinking about the implications of what it means to split the market and to have what they call seams around the boundaries of these markets that are really hard to work around. And then access to clean energy. We need to be thinking holistically about how we get clean energy to these data centers. We need sufficient clean energy resources to meet not just our policy mandates, but also the voluntary goals that the tech industry has set for itself. We need data centers to be sited with clean energy in mind. So that means planning years in advance, not just thinking about water, not just thinking about where property tax breaks can be gotten, not just thinking about land use restrictions, but thinking about energy really critically in the planning for siting data centers. And then we got to think about all options for procurement. So evaluating where's the nearest transmission. Can we do on-site generation? Is there nearby utility scale renewables? What's the possibility for direct access? That's something I think we really need to work on. There's caps on direct access, and we need to figure out how to raise those so that that's another option. And then repowering and reinvesting in existing renewable facilities is really important because we're so constrained on the land side. We've got to be able to make sure that our current utility scale renewables continue to operate. So I'm going to talk about 3 bills that are, as I said, that are pending in the Oregon legislature. That's where I do my work. So that's the bills that you're going to get. HB 3336 is modeled after bills that have passed in at least a dozen other states outside of Oregon related to grid enhancing technologies. It requires our investor-owned utilities to conduct a cost effectiveness analysis of GETS, considering all of the benefits to the system that GETS bring in terms of efficiency, in terms of cost gains, in terms of wildfire prevention, meeting our clean energy policy goals. So they look at the cost against all of those benefits. And then as a next step, whatever gets meet that cost effectiveness test would get input into a strategic plan that would be included in the integrated resources plan and clean energy plan. And then those GETs would have to be deployed onto the grid by 2030. So we're setting a timeline for actually physically getting those GETs onto the system. The next one is a permitting reform bill that is also part of this transmission package that Representative Gamba is bringing. It requires our Energy Facility Siting Council to conclude a contested case and issue an order within 12 months. That is a lot shorter than they usually issue an order. And from my understanding, almost every site certificate that's issued will go to a contested case. And so this is really important in making sure that those final orders are issued in a timely manner. After those orders are issued, appellants can then go into the court system and appeal to the state courts. The bill would confer jurisdiction directly on the Oregon Supreme Court, so we wouldn't have to wind our way through the lower courts. Again, major gain there in terms of the timeline. So those appeals would be handled by the Supreme Court. And then finally, the bill would allow minor changes to a site boundary without an amendment to that site certificate. So say you think, oh, damn, we need 10 more feet on the site boundary. If that's a nominal change without significant impact, then you can do that change without actually going back to FSEC, to the agency, to get that approved. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to finish this up quickly. The POWER Act, Protecting Oregonians with Energy Responsibility. So this is related to that cost allocation issue that I talked about before. This bill would have the PUC assign the costs of serving data centers to their own ratepayer class or assign those costs directly to the data center. It also requires our PUC to mitigate cost impacts to other ratepayers in whatever way the agency feels is necessary. And then it would have that minimum take percentage that I also talked about, and that would be determined by the PUC. And then there's also a possible excess demand charge. So we know we want the data centers to have a minimum take. We also know that if they're taking much more energy than they've committed to, just like anything else where you get a surcharge for taking too much, probably should have a surcharge there as well. All of these bills are currently pending in the legislature. The GETS bill has passed the House and is headed over to the Senate side. The permitting bill is maybe getting a vote in the House as we speak. And the POWER Act just got a vote on the House side and is heading over to the Senate. So I will stop there. Thanks.
So I told you we had some really wonderful experts here. Check time. Okay. I'm only going to ask one of my 5 questions because I want to hear from the audience. So which one am I going to ask? Let's see. I think I want to ask the equity question, or two questions related to that. What are the equity trade-offs of this increased demand for electricity on the communities and the energy grids where the data centers are located? So who would like to answer that? If no one, I will pick. Is that on? Yeah.
Josh will talk about a little bit around the cost recovery issue and how do you ring-fence costs. I think that's a pretty important element of how you address this load growth issue. Oh, that's great. And this is something we've been really focused on because, and it actually goes back to the issue of speed, because the way we think about it is that if you are going into a market and you are introducing a lot of objection to your development from other ratepayers, you're going to go slower. So going back to the price insensitivity issue here, I think there are better and worse ways to design minimum bill provisions, and we can talk about that. But I am a firm believer in the idea is that every data center should be 100% responsible for the costs that are incurred to serve that load. And so utilities really need to be thinking about how do they design ring-fence tariffs. And it's good for the utility, it's good for the ratepayers, and actually good for the data center too, because then it also allows you a lot of flexibility about what you want to put inside of that tariff. And one of the things, I mean, a few years ago, I was in the Southeast talking to one of the utilities there, and we were building a multi-hundred megawatt, several hundred megawatt data center inside their system. We had just signed a deal with Q-Cells to buy 2.5 gigawatts or so of solar panels out of a production facility there in Georgia. And Georgia's solar tariff was capped at 250 megawatts. And so I said, so I'm going to produce 2 gigawatts of solar panels in your state, and I'm going to have to take them to North Carolina to plug them in because you have this silly restriction, some arbitrary cap. I was like, why don't you allow me inside of this ring-fence tariff to do whatever the hell I want with solar in Georgia? Like, why should I be limited? If I'm willing to pay 100% of it and produce the solar panels in your state, I should be able to plug every single one of those in your state. Right? So it's a benefit too for the data center customer as well, because it does allow them flexibility to maybe do things that are outside of other sort of tariff mechanisms, because if I'm paying for all of it, I should be able to do whatever I want. Right? So there's benefits all around.
Any other comments from the panel about the equity trade-offs or the communities, or any comments about community benefits agreements or ways that the communities can be benefited? Yeah, Edith.
I mean, I think it's really important for us to think it through and be really thoughtful. I think it goes along the point of like acceptability, but also protection. So I kind of see two parts. I see the community benefits being one part, and then protections against what if scenarios as the other part. So I believe it was the Indiana PUC that just came out with a really interesting order that was kind of a negotiated agreement between the utilities and the tech companies and the PUC and the consumer advocate. And they highlighted a lot of the issues that kind of bubbled up just in terms of what if the data centers drop out for some reason, and then we're saddled with the bill, right? And that's kind of based on other large industries and what's happened over time. So how do we protect against that? How do we protect against the costs of building out the system to make sure that there's proportionality? And there were a lot of others. There was a really just thoughtful list of issues that they worked through. So I kind of encourage folks to look at that one. There might be others. I'm also interested if anybody else has read another kind of interesting evaluation that reflects a dialogue that's happened. But I think it does I think it's really important to think about. There are a lot of concerns around this, and so we have to put some thought into it. And on the community benefits side, I think that thinking about how to. I see a lot about. I used AI to help prepare for this panel. By the way. I was like, I might as well use some data center load, and so I asked all sorts of crazy questions, and you always get a positive answer, but then you dig in and you're like, but it's not really happening. And so I asked all about community benefits. And most of what you see, most of the concrete examples I could find focused on the jobs that data centers bring and the training that they bring to help get jobs related to tech. I saw a lot less about helping low-income households through things like weatherization to have lower bills overall, and also to protect against risks against rising costs that are happening on the broader energy system. And I think that just thinking about kind of where the community needs are and kind of creative ways to build those kinds of benefits would be really important as well.
I'm definitely going to be very interested in what the Governor Ferguson's tax force comes about with tax, because I think that's a key part that needs a lot of examination in addition to the rates. Okay, so
Eileen, if I could just
Yes.
add, from a utility perspective, I just want to reinforce what Kate said about coming up with a vision that we can all work together on. And then, thinking about what Brian said, the companies developing these data centers are wealthy. And they are committed to their sustainability goals. That's what we hear. And so I have a hypothesis that it is going to be these companies that accelerate the transition to clean energy. And I think there's a lot of value in that. And so I appreciate the approach and the vision, and let's all work together.
agree. Okay, so Ruby has the mic. And so Nancy Hirsch up here in the front, and then Emily Moore, and Greg Small, and Ross. And Liz, I know you have one too. Okay, so now I have to remember that.
I sit in the front row for a reason, because then I can throw my hand up right away and get seen by the moderator, so it's perfect. I guess I have a two-part question. Brian, you talked about the data centers optimizing with the utility. Other than on their kind of non-server loads, I haven't really heard that from the tech sector. They say, actually, we don't have a lot of ability to manage load in these servers. We can't do demand response yet. So my question is that coming? And then the second question, since I have the mic, relates to the kind of the affordability. Even if data centers are taking responsibility for all the costs associated with new generation, they're driving up the whole market cost because they're potentially able to pay more for that new solar farm or that new wind farm or a battery system. And so utilities are then losing suppliers, generation developers to the data center load that are not being used to help serve the clean energy transition. Or if they are finding more developers, they're raising their costs because the competition is buying at a higher price. So how do we address that affordability issue in the overall market cost going up? So that question be for anybody, right?
Yeah, I want to actually start with that question first, because I think that's a really interesting one. And I think it goes to sort of a fundamental problem, because if you talk to grid operators, and some of the comments were made here, like the commentary is always, hey, we have a lot of stuff we want to build. And then of course you talk to data center operators and they're like, well, we have a lot of stuff we want to buy. It's like, well, this seems easy, right? You've got a customer wants to buy something, if someone wants to sell something, yet somehow it's really hard to build things. And it fundamentally goes to the fact that the pricing for electricity is nearly entirely inelastic towards load side demand. So I was talking to a utility executive a couple months ago about this, and I said, the problem with your business is you sell an electron in 2027 for the same price you sell it in 2030. Like the elasticity of electricity prices is all about generation dispatch. It is not about load. So if someone shows up, so my wife and I went and saw Taylor Swift at the last concert in Vancouver. I will tell you, the price elasticity for Taylor Swift tickets is perfectly elastic to your willingness to pay. Like whoever will pay more will get that ticket. But that's not how it works in electricity, right? So this is part of this disconnect, I think, is that utilities don't have models to capture that willingness to pay. And if you would be able to go, and this is where I think AI could start to be really helpful, because if you could go to an individual customer queue request that says, hey, I really want power in 2027. And you'll be like, great, how badly do you want it? Because I could go deploy this GETS solution, I could put this long duration battery here, I could do this, I could do that, and I could give you exactly what you want. And that's going to come with a price, and it's going to be a different price. And you could get to a fully differentiated price system where willingness to pay, and then that way you're still insulating the rest of customers. You're getting this very large load in there that is actually still benefiting the rest of the customers because there's still a denominator in the overall system. But you're also capturing their willingness to pay to go faster. Like electricity markets just don't work that way. And this is where it gets really maddening of utilities and grid operators want to build things and customers want to buy things, but our markets don't function like that. So we have to find ways to create better functioning markets for that willingness to pay to match that and do it in a way that insulates that from where you don't have all those benefits going elsewhere, but the utilities can actually start to capture those benefits. Because right now the benefits are going to a bunch of different perverse areas, right? I'll give you a perfect example because this is my business. I buy land. If I have a piece of land that has a Q interconnection in 2027, and it's the fastest interconnection in the market, it's the most valuable piece of land in that market. So I'm, in essence, taking the utilities rents, and it's getting transferred to a piece of land, which has nothing to do with the actual delivery of electricity, right? It doesn't make any sense. So that's my general thoughts about the price and elasticity issue. On the load flexibility issue, I personally, Christian would actually be a better person to talk about this than I would. In all my years at Microsoft, I'm not optimistic that you're going to see a lot of movement on load flexibility on the server side, because there's so many other things that Microsoft, that AWS, that they have to think about. Flexibility on the power system is very, very low on the list. You know, it's customer data security, it's privacy, it's availability, that's just never an argument. And we talked about a lot. Liz was involved in a lot of those discussions over the years about, flexibility and efficiency of our system. It was always a losing argument. It was always easier for us to focus on the actual physical energy assets, the batteries, generators. That was way easier than trying to convince, several thousand engineers to rewrite some code. And you don't want to strand a server because, right, the server is the most expensive thing in the data center. And so the underutilization of that server to flex it up and down, it's like, well, you're taking your most expensive thing, you're not using it. And so that's also part of the resistance to doing anything on the actual computation side.
Any other comments from the panel before we go to Emily? Okay. Emily Moore from Sightline.
Hi, thank you so much for putting this event together, and thank you, everyone. I'm Emily Moore. I'm the Director of Climate and Energy at Sightline Institute. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces in the room, some of which I've only seen on Zoom before, so this is nice. I'm Sightline. We're actually going to be publishing a report in the next couple of weeks about data centers, specifically focused on the emissions profile and clean energy transition, so this is very well timed. My question is, there's a theme throughout this about how can data centers be a partner in the clean energy transition and actually maybe accelerate it. And some of the comments we've heard about affordability have been more about how do we just mitigate the negative impacts or protect everyone else. And I'm wondering, this might be for you, Brian, or maybe for other people, are there opportunities to actually leverage the capital of the tech companies behind the data centers to pay for to almost underwrite or subsidize the energy transition for everybody else? Because I think that might help with some of what you're talking about, Kate, around the narrative challenge that there is right now. And so I'm wondering if there are policy or regulatory solutions that we've seen deployed or that could be deployed that could actually leverage some of that capital. I've seen some examples of kind of green tariffs, but more advanced versions. I'm wondering if there's anything else that anybody could speak to. Thank you.
I'm happy to answer, but I've talked a lot too. So.
Do you have anything, Diane?
Well, I could briefly, I'll give the umbrella and you can give the details of that. Yes, green tariffs were also, I think someone mentioned the ability to do direct access. But that doesn't necessarily answer the question of how does that benefit the other customers as well. It does help isolate the cost more and on the affordability, but is there, in my mind, what I'm imagining is a process where, and it also kind of gets to your equity question earlier, Eileen, is how are we capturing the benefit of improved grid access for these data centers in a way that can improve the grid for everyone else as well? And I'm definitely not a transmission engineer, but I have heard, like that improvements in one part of the grid benefits everywhere else. It just allows better flow. It can alleviate some constraints in areas that aren't even nearby because you can reroute things. So I think that that's where my mind goes in terms of how can we leverage and if they are paying for upgrades, can we integrate those upgrades into broader planning and in a way that can be tweaked to have more technical or actual grid impacts and improvements for everyone else around them? And I think that's all I wanted to say. You probably have very specific. I think there was something else you mentioned, but I've forgotten, so I'll pass it to Brian.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we're trying to address, it goes back to that lack of transparency and elasticity in capacity markets specifically, because really what we're talking about is how do you value capacity? We've become really good at operating energy markets. We never got really good at designing efficient capacity markets. I don't think there's efficient capacity market anywhere in the country. And that's fine in an era of no load growth, when really what you're trading on is energy. And that's what we did for the last 20 years is we created really great energy markets. But in a world of load growth, capacity is the only thing that matters. And so if you don't have a good capacity market, then how do you send the appropriate signals? And so reforming capacity markets and regulation around that is super important. What we're trying to do right now is create sort of bilateral scenarios. We're actually working, and Taylor, who's on my team here, is working with Level 10 to run sort of the first capacity RFP. In fact, I think we're running it like on Thursday, right? Where what we're trying to do is send a signal out into the market to what would ordinarily be considered energy resources to say, hey, you have this thing that's super valuable, which is a unit of accredited capacity in a particular year that I'm willing to pay a much higher price than what the market says it's actually worth. And so how do we start to uncover what those resources are and things that aren't getting dispatched that should get dispatched? That might be virtual power plants. That may be solar projects and wind projects. We can aggregate and solar, you can aggregate these things together. And suddenly you're sending this new price signal into the market that could help some of these projects interconnect faster. And this is one of the things when I really think about like what is the benefit of data centers and their high willingness to pay? A lot of it is around accelerating technologies that maybe would not get deployed as soon as they should because they're getting undervalued because of there's no capacity market signal. So if you could give them that market signal to say, no, this asset is actually worth a lot more than you think it is, the market's sending you the wrong signal. That's where I think there's a lot of opportunity. So this is an area where I would love to see a lot of focus around, capacity market formation and reformation.
Emily, you asked maybe about some examples, and the one example that I am aware of is Google working with Fervo Energy and Envy Energy on the development of their clean transition tariff. And that's about capacity, firm, clean capacity. And Google really taking on the financial risk for advanced geothermal, and Envy, working with Google to come up with that regulatory framework where Google takes on all the risk and its customers, existing customers, are protected. Google, what I heard from their staff, and they shared this information with the PNUCC board at our April meeting, they want to see this clean transition tariff become an example for other regions to use as other regions seek that firm, clean capacity. So it's something that we should all explore.
Joshua, I know you had something you wanted to add.
Yeah, I agree with what Brian said, and thank you. Agree with what Brian said and what Edith said. I think there's some great examples in the East, particularly in Virginia, where Amazon has made very significant investments to get utility scale clean energy renewables started and then have the ability to offtake from them. I'm thinking about Virginia and Ohio, where they've been able to use that model. I think it's just more difficult in our region. There's certainly not, there's certainly a willingness to pay. I mean, I think the dollars are there. But I think that those types of projects, at a utility scale where they can offtake enough to make it significant, I think there's just fewer opportunities for that. I will say, I don't know if anyone from AWS is here, but AWS did make an agreement to repower a wind project called the Leaning Juniper Project, which is a fairly small wind farm, but they are using that type of model, making that investment, getting the project repowered so that it's going to operate for several more years, and then off-taking some of the energy. And I think hopefully as we expand the grid and we get projects out of the queue, there will be more opportunities for that.
Josh, what do you think the issue, or one of the issues of why it's less, we see it less here, is the balkanization? The lack of, I see Brian nodding.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, our lack of a full RTO, I think, is definitely.
Hey, if they can do it in Nevada, we can do it here.
Okay, next up we had Greg Small. You're passing? Okay. Ross McFarland.
Hey, Ross McFarland from the CETI board and just a general climate energy gadfly around town. So I believe you all that we need to build a lot more for this as well as other things. But, I'm old enough to remember some of the massive over forecasting from the 1980s and some other periods, and also the conventional wisdom around the utility death spiral, where all the utilities were going to go away from the last decade. And I'm just interested in your thoughts of whether there is a need to also be careful on over forecasting here. And then fitting into that, energy stocks as well as tech stocks got hammered back when DeepSeek was announced, talking about or demonstrating much more efficient AI. I realize AI is only part of the demand for data centers, but is that a factor, do you think, or is the greater efficiency just going to get eaten up by Jevons paradox in this area?
Yeah, I do think it's the latter. I do think I'm a firm believer in continued growth in demand for computation and hence demand for electricity. I think what the demand we're feeding is just human capacity to consume data, and this has been around for millennia. This goes back to the printing press at the beginning, and then we're always looking for ways to create more ability for us to consume data, which is now computation. So I'm a firm believer in that. Ross, I do think you're right in that, like someone mentioned it earlier, the sum total of all utility IRPs way overstates the demand today, right? And, I was talking to one utility who has a very, very large data center queue. And I said, well, how much of that queue are you forecasting, to the street that's actually going to materialize? And they said, well, 100%. And I was like, don't do that. It's not 100%. Because if I go to the next utility, the next utility, we're building a billion gigawatts. This is not, there's definitely double counting in the system. And so this is where it's incumbent upon planning organizations to take a more rational approach to say, what is realistically going to happen across a region? And what is a good forecast for the actual underlying fundamental demand that takes into account things like efficiency and other things, and unfortunately, we were talking about this at the beginning before everyone got here, but I was just laughing about how terrible we were at forecasting demand at Microsoft when I was there. And it's true at Google and it's true at Amazon, and everyone you talk to says the same thing. It's really hard to forecast this stuff. You don't know what the uptake is. I mean, no one saw ChatGPT coming, nobody. And every tech executive has said this at one point or another, we were surprised how quickly this caught the collective consciousness. It's really hard to forecast this stuff. So I don't think the tech companies are going to be incredibly helpful in giving us better insight. So I think that the most important thing we can do, and go back to that sort of ring fencing issue, is to say that, okay, if utility X is going to make a bet on someone needs another gigawatt of capacity, it's not going to be on the ratepayers to pick that up if it doesn't happen, right? You have to put that, and they're the right entities to take that bet. Whether it's, and it's funny when you talk to the tech companies, and I don't know, we don't have anyone represented here. It's funny the things I can say when I don't work for them anymore. Because when you talk to the tech companies, they're like, well, I don't want to take that risk either. And so this is actually why you see a lot of private equity participation in the space in the big, co-location companies, and because it's really a private equity bet to make. Like, it's really private equity should come in and say, I want to bet on the need for 10 more gigawatts or 20 more gigawatts or 50 more gigawatts of power in a region. Let them take that bet. That's what they're there for. And I know for a fact, because I've talked to utility executives, to say, we have private equity companies calling us every week saying, how can we deploy capital in your space? Like, how can we, and that's another sort of inefficiency in the market that exists, is you have this pool of capital that really wants to spend money on energy infrastructure, but all of the different regulations and barriers that exist in between them and the customer make it really hard to get that happen. So that's another thing that we need to think about in terms of how do we reform markets where we allow the right sort of risk capital come in place at the right time and ensure that at the end of the day, the ratepayers are insulated from whatever's going on that side of the wall. Because that's the thing that, Ross, as you're loading all the things we've had over the years of overbuilding stuff, at the end of the day, it's usually the ratepayers that were on the hook. And so we can't let that happen. We have to be more creative about how we design sort of the risk mechanisms this time around.
Ross, last year, I presented the forecast at the Northwest Energy Coalition meeting in Boise, and Sarah Patton asked me the same question. So I feel like I just had a flashback from that. We can't forget that we haven't really invested in the energy infrastructure in our region for years, largely because loads haven't increased, they've been stagnant, and also because it's hard. It's really hard to build energy infrastructure. So, if we can make some progress on building that infrastructure, I think we're going to fill the need that we generate with that progress.
Okay, I think Liz and then Kelly Jo. Kelly Jo will have the last question. Liz Thomas.
Thanks, Ruby. Thanks, Eileen. I'm going to say, I love the idea of ring fencing. Ross stole my thunder because we're the same generation. I was going to say, aluminum companies?
Yeah.
Elastic demand? Maybe so. And then I was going to say stranded costs. Yeah, we've talked about those before. So, there are a number of mechanisms that are available, like termination fees and exit fees. But I think ring fencing may be a very useful concept in this day and age because it comes out of the world of finance. And so maybe that's a helpful frame for folks to use as we try to think about how to insulate ratepayers, particularly low-income ratepayers, from rate shock that would otherwise materialize should there be some radical change in the tech industry that causes the demand not to materialize or, worse yet, to vaporize. So that's not a question. My question is about breaking down silos, which I think is also a terrific concept. Do we think that, for example, linkage of carbon markets can lead to a mechanism where we could help break down silos better between the states and the Pacific Northwest so that we can get on with the policies that I think we have a lot of broad agreement, even though the federal government is absent right now?
Anyone want to take that?
Well, I'll maybe broaden it from the carbon markets and kind of grab on, like, how do we break down the silos? Yeah, in the region. And I'm one brick at a time. But yeah, no, it's a great question. And I mentioned RAP, West Tech. There are several initiatives that are trying to accomplish.
Diane, maybe say what they are.
Oh, yes.
Not everybody knows. I was going to interrupt before, so not everybody knows West Tech.
So RAP, the Western Resource Adequacy Program that's being run out of the Western Power Pool, bringing all the utilities together to talk about forward-looking forecasts and also what they think they're going to have for supply. And then West Tech is an initiative that is bringing together, again, all of the West-wide utilities, public, both, and BPA is at the table to put together a 10 and 20-year I'm looking at Crystal. I can't
Yes,
think
that's
of
right.
20 year, right?
10 and 20 years.
Plan for transmission for the region. But that's where it stops, is at the planning phase, and then the paying and permitting is up to whoever decides, the ones who are going to build it. So there are those initiatives, and then there's also, Joshua mentioned the markets that the real time and the day ahead markets for the wholesale electricity. I think there are a bunch of these little pieces out there that are trying to take bite size out of these silos. It doesn't get us to the full on coordination that we would see with an RTO or an ISO, but it does have baby steps there, because we have some pretty large questions about how much integration we could really have in the region. In my mind, as I think about it, we've got that federal agency. What does that look like to be a part of an RTO or
And Diane, an RTO,
RTO,
and
Regional
an
Transmission
ISO.
Organization? Thank you.
Thank
Kind of like what we see in California system operator, or ERCOT in Texas. So yes, there are a lot of outstanding questions on how do we get to that end goal of fully cooperating and integrating, but I think there are baby steps, and even some big, more toddler preschool steps that are happening with those different platforms that I mentioned.
I think we've called them incremental steps, right? And we
Big
have been
fans
at
of
them for
incrementalism.
a while. And Diane went through a number of organizations and their acronyms, but really it is getting at that more organized approach, which we lack in this region. And it has been challenging for many reasons, but we are taking those incremental approach. You asked about carbon markets, but again, these incremental approach are trying to get us to break down those silos to work better together.
All right, Kelly Jo MacArthur.
Thank you. Thank you for the discussion. It's been really great. It's a great panel. Thanks, Eileen, for putting it together. So my question is, I guess, a question that could be asked in any room today about any topic. And that is going to be about the impact of the federal government. So I want to posit that the way you're thinking is really brilliant and wonderful. But what we see happening, and I think what we're going to anticipate and see more, is a federal government approach that is a lot more top-down. And once they get organized, and they're trying, that doesn't mean they're going to be educated and they're going to be as smart on these topics as you will. They may move very, very, very fast because of the pressure they're going to have to get data centers running in the United States for AI very quickly because of some of the, global issues and anti-China issues. So how do you anticipate operating within that framework? Because it could be a whole new ballgame, something we've not really encountered given what we're seeing coming out of those, coming out of that government right now.
Joshua's happy to start.
So I think you could go any number of directions when we open up the Pandora's box of the federal government. We could talk about tariffs. We could talk about clean energy. We could talk about executive orders and relating to state clean energy policy. But I do think I think one major risk that we have in the near term is that there are a number of states where the data center load has manifested so quickly that where they had planned to decommission some of their fossil fuel resources, they had to delay those decommissions. So they were going to decommission coal plants, and they just, in order to maintain like near-term reliability on the system, they weren't able to decommission those fossil fuel resources as quickly. And so I think in a lot of ways, we're like teetering on the edge of being able to decarbonize and phase out fossil fuel resources, not to mention to backfill that energy with clean resources. And so even like the little bit of kick that Trump is giving to fossil fuels, I think could put that over the edge, and we could see a lot of those fossil fuel resources like continuing indefinitely. And I think that is a real risk from the administration.
Yep, go ahead. Anybody else?
I mean, we might all have something to say. We'll go this way. I would add, just kind of starting where Joshua dropped or stopped, is that I think one of the things that keeps coming to mind for myself is, and when I'm thinking about it, is renewable energy resources are cost competitive. That's been a big change in the last 5-10 years in the industry. So absolutely, I think we're probably going to see gas on the system longer than maybe we want to, but also renewables are still competitive. Even without the IRA, IRA would be great if we could keep it. But even without the IRA, there's still the least cost, least risk resource in most utility plans that are selected. So I just want to remind, it's hard to forget, or it's easy to forget that in the current situation. So just to remind us all that renewables are the least cost, least risk resource. And then I'm also comforted somewhat by the fact that transmission is energy agnostic. So regardless of what is generating the electrons that go on the system, we still need more of that transmission. So those are the two things that I'm thinking about and trying to figure out where I can continue to plug those away.
I'm going to jump in right there with Diane, because one of the things that concerns me most is the transmission system in our region, and it is operated and owned by the Bonneville Power Administration. This administration's kind of cruel approach and disrespect for federal employees is very disheartening. And it is going to have a big impact in our region because the Bonneville Power Administration is not going to be able to build the transmission system that we need for the future. And so this is an area where people should be aware. And Spencer and I are working together. We have maybe made some progress in stemming some of the immediate concern, but there's still hiring freeze in the federal government, and Bonneville Power Administration is subject to that hiring freeze, and it has now been extended. And so maybe there won't be as many people who leave BPA, but they still can't hire. And it was resource constrained before. And so I don't want to end this on not a pessimistic view. So I'm going to turn it over to Brian, the eternal optimist.
All right. I wasn't even going to say anything, Crystal, but
have to now.
No, I have to. Well, here's a point of optimism. So if you go back to the last decade, I mean, the tech companies really were the leaders in driving the adoption of clean energy at the corporate level. People like Ron and Taylor and Liz and all these people that were involved in this stuff. I think, though, that they do have a new responsibility, which is around clean capacity. It's not because in the market that we were in the 2010s, there was no load growth. So every incremental wind project, solar project we brought online was a net reduction of capacity. We were displacing some carbon-based resource, some more than others based on locational marginal emissions, et cetera. But it was all moving in the right direction. Like we were doing the right thing for the climate, we were doing the right thing for the grid. The new world of complexity we're in is just putting renewable energy on the grid and plugging your data center in, and that data center happens to also then keep a coal plant online for another 10 years. You're not doing the same thing that you were doing before. So in a load growth world, you actually have to be thinking about the capacity impact of connecting those data centers. So I think we do need to keep pressure on my former employer and all the other big tech companies to really be creative around, think about what you did the last decade. It was huge. It had a huge impact on the business community, on investment in renewable energy. There is a new opportunity. It's just there's a new set of challenges. So we have to get creative, and it's going to take a lot of working with grid operators and planners and utilities to get super creative around how we leverage this demand and this willingness to pay to drive a lot of innovation in the space.
I have a positive thing.
Edith wanted to say something too, right? Okay, you can bring us home, Edith.
Okay. I was just going to say that.
Okay, sorry. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So I was going to talk about my concerns with BPA. I was going to talk about my concerns with federal funding. But I think maybe a more positive note is I have a lot of faith in the state's climate laws, speaking for both Washington and Oregon, if I might. Our states are fully empowered and it is legal for us to have the climate laws that we do. And the federal administration is not changing that in spite of some executive orders recently. And so, thank you, Greg. And so I have hope that corporate sustainability goals will stay in place in spite of the need for speed, but I have more concrete faith in our state climate laws serving as that backstop. And so, Washington's State Environmental Policy Act is not going anywhere, even if something happens to NEPA at the national level. We also in Washington, we might be going through a historic budget crisis right now, but we have the Climate Commitment Act, which is bringing in revenues for our state specifically for climate projects. And so, and again, federal funding is not a piece of our CCA money. And so, I have concerns obviously about what the federal government could do in the data center space, but I have a lot of faith that that doesn't change the way that we build things in Washington on the ground level. And I hope that's not a naive thing to say. Edith, I'll turn to you.
All right, yeah, so I'm going to echo everything everybody said. I'm going to bring us home with like a metaphor, which is a marathon, right? Decarbonization is a marathon. It doesn't happen overnight. And today, I think we're in mile 7 to 10. It starts to hurt around mile 7 to 10, and you're like, how the hell are we going to do this? So there are headwinds over the next few years. But there are things that we can do that help lay the groundwork to continue to ramp up over time. And those would be consistent with the things we need to do anyway. And those are things that we've talked about. They're markets, they're the grid, they're VPPs, figuring out how we can value, monetize, and sell flexibility as we electrify and as we get these new loads. We need to think about differently about the demand side. And so I would say that right now we've been running the marathon barefoot and our feet hurt. So we need to make the shoes, and we've been drinking water. We need some power gel. And so we can work on some of those things and kind of lay the groundwork. So even if we have a slower trajectory in terms of the carbon profile of the emissions profile of the system, we have strong state policies. And there are a lot of initiatives underway that are building that groundwork that we need, that we're lacking. And so we just need to continue along that. And that's my positive metaphor and spin.
Great metaphor.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to thank everybody, especially this fabulous panel. So let's give them a hand. Thank you all for staying through this very interesting and a complicated conversation. Thank you for agreeing to work with us on all of the regional initiatives that we talked about. And I invite you to enjoy a beverage of your choice and some food. And we have a box for name tags. So as you're leaving, please remember to drop it into the box so that we can use them again and they don't get into a landfill. Thank you all very much.